He worked quietly every morning before the sun fully rose, and before the grand hall filled with voices, music, and expensive perfume, and his name was rarely spoken by anyone who mattered in that place. And when it was spoken, it was usually followed by a command or complaint, because to them, he was only the janitor, a man whose job was to clean floors, polish marble steps, wipe fingerprints from golden railings, and make sure the world of the wealthy looked flawless before they arrived, and he accepted this role without argument because life had taught him that survival sometimes meant silence and endurance rather than resistance. And each day, he moved through the building with a small cart, a mop, a bucket, and a calm expression that hid a long history of struggle, dreams, and loss that no one ever asked about. The building itself was a symbol of power and privilege, and it hosted events that celebrated wealth, influence, and status. And on this particular week, it was preparing for a lavish gathering organized by a rich businessman known for his sharp tongue and louder pride. And this man enjoyed surrounding himself with people who admired him, feared him, or wanted something from him. And he believed deeply that money was the ultimate measure of worth, and anyone without it simply had not tried hard enough or was not talented enough to deserve more. And this belief shaped how he treated everyone around him, especially those who served him. And he made little effort to hide his disdain for workers like the janitor, who passed him silently in hallways every day. The janitor had learned the rhythms of the building and knew when to stay invisible and when to move quickly, and he also knew the quiet moments when the hall was empty and the grand piano stood alone under the soft glow of chandeliers. And during those moments, something inside him stirred, because the piano was not just an object to him. It was a memory, a connection to a life he once had or dreamed of having long ago when he was younger and life had not yet taken so much from him. And though his hands were rough from years of labor, they remembered the shape of keys, the distance between notes, and the feeling of music flowing through his body like breath. Years earlier, before poverty forced hard choices, he had studied music with devotion and hope, and he had practiced late into the night in a small apartment with thin walls and patient neighbors. And he believed talent would open doors for him, but life turned sharply when illness struck his family and responsibility replaced ambition. And he left behind concerts, lessons, and auditions to take whatever work he could find, and over time the world stopped asking who he was, and only cared about. And slowly the title of janitor replaced the identity of musician, until even he began to forget that music was once his first language. On the day of the event, the rich man arrived early, walking through the hall with confidence and criticism, pointing out spots that needed cleaning even when they were already spotless. And the janitor listened, nodded, and corrected things that did not need correction because it was easier than arguing. And as the rich man talked, he noticed the piano and made a joke about it, saying it was a decoration more than an instrument because no one here truly appreciated real music anymore. And he laughed loudly, enjoying his own words, and the people around him smiled politely, even if they did not find it funny. Later, as the janitor cleaned near the stage, he heard the rich man speaking with guests, boasting about his taste, his wealth, and his influence. And at some point the conversation turned playful and mocking, and someone mentioned talent and opportunity, and the rich man scoffed and said that talent without money meant nothing and that anyone could claim to be gifted. And then with a smirk he looked toward the janitor and made a cruel joke, suggesting that even the janitor could claim to be a pianist if he wanted, and laughter followed, and though it was not loud, it was enough to sting, and the janitor felt heat rise in his chest. But he kept his eyes down and continued working. Yet something shifted inside him, because the words touched an old wound and an old fire, and he felt the weight of years of silence pressing against his ribs. And for a brief moment he imagined walking away as he always did, but instead he imagined the piano, the sound of it, the truth it carried. And before he fully realized what he was doing, he stood still and listened to the echo of his own breathing, and in that pause he remembered who he had been and who he still was beneath the uniform and the routine. The rich man noticed the pause and, with mockery in his voice, challenged the janitor, asking if he wanted to prove something, and teasingly said that if he could play the piano well enough he would earn respect, laughter, and even an impossible promise thrown like bait. And the room grew quiet, not because anyone believed the janitor would respond, but because they were curious to see how he would react. And the janitor looked up, slowly meeting the eyes of people who had never truly seen him. And in that moment fear and courage stood side by side inside him. He thought of his past, of long nights practicing, of sacrifices made, of music abandoned but not erased. And he realized that this might be the only chance he would ever have to let the truth speak for him. And without saying much he nodded gently and stepped toward the piano, and his movements were calm, not rushed, not dramatic. And as he sat down he placed his hands above the keys, feeling the familiar distance and weight, and the room held its breath, though no one knew it yet. And this was the beginning of a moment that would change how they saw him and how he saw himself, and the story of that change was only just beginning. The room felt different the moment his fingers hovered above the keys. And even before a single sound was made, the air seemed heavier, as if everyone sensed that something unexpected was about to happen. And the janitor closed his eyes, not to escape the crowd, but to return to himself, because this piano was not surrounded by laughter or judgment in his mind. It was in a small, quiet room from long ago where music had once been his only certainty. And as he took a slow breath, his shoulders relaxed, and the stiffness of years of labor faded just enough for memory to guide his hands. When he began to play, the first notes were soft and careful, not because he lacked confidence, but because he was listening to the instrument, learning its voice, and adjusting to its response. and the sound that filled the hall was clean and warm, and unlike the casual background music people expected, it carried intention and feeling. And some of the guests shifted, slightly surprised by the control in his touch, while others leaned forward without realizing it, drawn by something honest in the melody. The rich man at first smiled, as if amused, convinced that this was nothing more than a brief trick or coincidence. And he crossed his arms, watching closely, prepared to laugh the moment a mistake appeared, but the mistake never came, and instead the music grew stronger and more complex, weaving emotion into each phrase, and the janitor played as if he were telling a story, one shaped by loss, endurance, and quiet hope, and each note landed with purpose, building something that could not be dismissed easily. As the melody unfolded, the laughter that once echoed in the room disappeared, replaced by stillness, and the janitor no longer saw the faces around him, because he was somewhere else, entirely reliving moments of joy, pain, and resilience, and his hands moved with a confidence that surprised even him, and the piano responded beautifully, filling the space with sound that felt alive and breathing. And for the first time in many years, he felt seen, not by the people but by the music itself. A woman near the front felt her throat tight, unsure why, tears suddenly pressed against her eyes, and a man beside her lowered his head, caught off guard by how deeply the performance reached him, and even those who had smiled cruelly before now stood silent, confronted by a truth they had not expected. And the janitor continued without pause, allowing the music to rise and fall naturally, never forcing drama, but letting sincerity guide every movement. The rich man shifted his stance, uncrossing his arms and leaning forward slightly, his expression changing from amusement to confusion, and then to discomfort, because the sound coming from the piano did not fit the story he believed in, and it challenged his idea that worth could be measured by wealth or status. And for the first time he felt unsure in his own house, surrounded by his own people, and that uncertainty unsettled him deeply. The janitor moved into a section of the piece that carried more intensity, and the notes became faster yet remained precise and controlled, showing years of discipline that could not be learned by chance. And the rhythm echoed through the hall like a heartbeat, steady and strong. And with each passing moment, the gap between who he was perceived to be and who he truly was grew wider, until it could no longer be ignored. Memories flowed through him as he played, memories of teachers who once believed in him, of opportunities lost not because of lack of talent, but because life demanded sacrifice. And he poured all of that into the music, not with anger but with acceptance and honesty, and that honesty resonated with everyone listening, because it was real and unfiltered and impossible to fake. The crowd now stood completely still, afraid to break the moment, and even the staff, who usually remained unnoticed, paused their work, listening with pride and disbelief. And the janitor felt something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of dignity returning, not because of applause or approval, but because he was finally expressing the part of himself that had been buried under years of quiet survival. As the piece reached its emotional peak, the music filled every corner of the room, rising like a wave, and then gently pulling back. And the final notes lingered in the air long after his fingers lifted from the keys, and silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the heavy, meaningful silence that comes when people are processing something they did not expect to feel. The janitor slowly opened his eyes and looked around, and what he saw surprised him, because the faces before him no longer held mockery or dismissal, but all confusion and respect, and some avoided his gaze, unsure how to reconcile their earlier laughter with what they had just witnessed. And he stood up calmly, stepping away from the piano, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, even though inside him something fundamental had shifted. The rich man remained silent, his mouth slightly open and his confidence shaken, and in that moment he realized that the joke he had made was no longer harmless, and that the power dynamic he relied on had slipped from his control. And though he would never admit it openly, he felt small, confronted by a man he had overlooked and underestimated, and the room waited not for applause but for acknowledgement of what had just occurred. This performance was not the end of the story, but it marked a turning point, because something irreversible had been set in motion, and the janitor had crossed an invisible line between invisibility and recognition. And whether the world accepted it or not, the truth had already been spoken through music, and there was no taking it back, and what followed would test not only the janitor but everyone who had witnessed that moment, and believed they understood how the world worked. The silence that followed the final note lingered longer than anyone expected, and no one moved at first, because the moment felt fragile, as if sound itself might shatter what had just been revealed. And the janitor stood near the piano, unsure whether to return to his cart or remain where he was, because for the first time in years, he was not invisible. And that realization brought both relief and fear into his chest at the same time. Slowly people began to react, though not with applause, because the weight of the performance demanded something deeper. And a few guests exchanged glances, trying to understand what this meant, and others looked at the rich man, waiting for his response, because his voice usually decided how moments like this were framed. And yet he said nothing, and that silence from him felt louder than any laughter had before. The janitor noticed small changes around him. A woman who had earlier laughed now looked at him with regret, and a man who once ignored him gave a small nod of respect. And these gestures, though quiet, carried meaning, and he felt his posture change naturally, his shoulders straightening, not in pride, but an acceptance of who he was and had always been, and he realized that music had not abandoned him, it had simply waited patiently. The rich man finally cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room, and he offered a half-smile that did not reach his eyes and spoke in a tone that sounded polite but strained, and he praised the performance, calling it impressive, unexpected, and entertaining. And yet his words lacked warmth because he was struggling to fit this reality into his worldview, and the janitor listened carefully, sensing that the praise was more about saving face than acknowledging truth. Someone from the crowd asked where he had learned to play, and the question carried genuine curiosity, and the janitor hesitated because his story was long and filled with hardship, and he was unsure how much of it belonged in this space. And so he answered, simply saying that he had learned many years ago and had practiced whenever life allowed, and his honesty carried no bitterness, only clarity. As conversations began to rise softly, the staff members returned to their tasks, but with new energy and subtle smiles, and one young worker whispered that he had always suspected something special about the janitor, and the janitor smiled back, feeling a connection he had not felt in years. And that connection reminded him that talent, when hidden, still leaves traces, and those traces are sometimes noticed by those who know what it means to struggle. The rich man stepped aside, speaking quietly with a few close associates, and his tone was sharp-edged with irritation because he felt exposed and challenged in front of people he wanted to impress. And he blamed himself for allowing the situation to unfold, yet deep down he knew that what bothered him most was not the loss of control, but the truth that had surfaced and refused to be dismissed. Meanwhile, guests continued to approach the janitor, offering compliments and questions, and he responded kindly but cautiously because he had learned not to trust sudden attention, and he understood that admiration could be fleeting and conditional. And yet he allowed himself to feel a small measure of hope, because something had shifted and the world around him no longer felt completely closed. One elderly guest spoke, gently telling him that his playing reminded her of concerts she had attended long ago, and her voice trembled slightly. And the janitor thanked her, realizing that music had bridged decades and differences in ways words never could, and that realization strengthened his belief that his gift still mattered regardless of where he stood socially. As the event resumed, the janitor returned to his duties, but nothing felt the same, and each step he took echoed with new meaning, and the mop in his hands no longer felt like a symbol of failure, but of survival and resilience. And he understood that dignity was not granted by others, but reclaimed through self-recognition and expression. The rich man watched him from a distance, noticing how people now acknowledged him, and that sight stirred discomfort, because it disrupted the hierarchy he relied on. And he questioned whether power built on dismissal was as solid as he once believed, and though he would never admit it openly, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not leave him easily. Later that evening, as guests departed, the hall grew quieter, and the janitor found himself alone again near the piano, and he placed his hand gently on its surface, not to play, but to thank it for giving voice to what he had carried for so long. And he felt a calm settle over him because regardless of what happened next, he had honored his truth, and that could not be undone. He did not know whether opportunities would follow or whether life would return to routine, but he knew that he had crossed an inner threshold and reclaimed a part of himself that had been waiting patiently, and that knowledge brought peace and strength. And as he finished his work and prepared to leave, he walked out of the building not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who had finally been heard, even if only for a moment, and that moment was enough to change the path ahead. The days that followed carried a strange, quiet tension for the janitor because nothing outwardly dramatic happened, yet everything felt different beneath the surface. And each morning, when he arrived at the building, he noticed subtle changes in how people looked at him and spoke to him, because greetings were warmer, pauses longer, and eyes more curious. And though no one announced it openly, the memory of that night still lived in the hallways like a soft echo that refused to fade. He returned to his routine with the same discipline as before, cleaning floors, arranging chairs, and preparing spaces for events. Yet his movements felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest, and he no longer felt the need to shrink himself to fit expectations, because he had proven something not only to others, but to himself, and that inner shift mattered more than applause or recognition. Whispers followed him at times, not cruel ones, but filled with curiosity and admiration, and some staff members asked gentle questions about his past, about where he learned music, and why he never pursued it further. And he answered honestly, sharing fragments of his story without dramatizing it, because he had learned that truth spoken calmly carried more power than exaggerated emotion, and people listened closely, sensing the authenticity in his words. The rich man, on the other hand, avoided him in the days that followed, and when their paths crossed, he kept interactions brief and formal, because the confidence he once carried so easily now felt strained, and he struggled to reconcile the image he had created of the janitor with the reality he had witnessed. And that internal conflict made him uneasy because it challenged the foundation of how he viewed success, merit, and control. Behind closed doors, the rich man spoke to colleagues about the incident, framing it as an entertaining surprise, yet his tone revealed irritation and discomfort. And though he dismissed it publicly, the performance lingered in his thoughts, especially during quiet moments when no one was watching. and he found himself questioning whether talent truly belonged only to those with access and privilege, or whether he had been wrong all along. Meanwhile, an unexpected opportunity began to take shape quietly, because one of the guests from that night happened to be connected to a local cultural center, and she had not forgotten the music or the emotion it carried, and she reached out discreetly asking if the janitor might consider playing at a small private gathering. And when the message reached him, he felt both excitement and fear, because the idea of stepping into that world again awakened old dreams and old wounds at the same time. He spent a long evening thinking about it, weighing the risk of disappointment against the chance to reconnect with music, and he realized that fear had kept him silent for years more than circumstance ever had. And with that realization, he agreed cautiously, not for fame or money, but for the simple need to let music breathe again through his hands. Preparation brought memories rushing back, and he practiced late at night in borrowed spaces, relearning pieces, refining technique, and rediscovering the joy of discipline. And though his hands ached from both work and practice, he welcomed the pain, because it reminded him that growth often required endurance and patience, and that he was capable of both. At work, the atmosphere continued to evolve, and supervisors treated him with newfound respect, not because of his job title, but because of what they now knew he carried within him. And while this respect felt validating, he remained grounded, reminding himself that dignity should never depend solely on recognition, because it could be taken away as easily as it was given. The night of the small gathering arrived, and he walked into the venue not as a janitor, but as a musician, though he carried humility with him like a shield. And when he sat at the piano, the room grew quiet in a way that felt familiar yet different from before, because this time the audience came not to mock or challenge, but to listen, and that intention changed everything. He played with the same honesty and restraint, allowing emotion to guide him naturally, and the response was warm, sincere, and deeply appreciative. And in that moment, he realized that music still had a place for him in the world, not as a dream deferred, but as a living, breathing part of who he was. And that realization filled him with calm rather than urgency. Word began to spread slowly, not through headlines or social media, but through conversations and recommendations, and each new opportunity arrived quietly, giving him space to choose rather than be pushed. And he continued working his job not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood the value of balance and stability, and he refused to abandon one part of his life for another without intention. The rich man eventually learned of these developments, and though he pretended indifference, he felt a growing discomfort because the narrative had shifted beyond his control. And he realized that his careless words had sparked a chain of events that no amount of wealth could reverse, and that realization forced him to confront the limits of his influence. As weeks passed, the janitor felt stronger, more centered, and more whole, and he understood that reclaiming his identity did not require abandoning humility or gratitude, and that growth could occur quietly without spectacle. And as he continued walking both paths, worker and musician, he carried a new sense of purpose, grounded not in validation, but in truth, and that truth continued to unfold, shaping the next chapter of his life in ways he had never imagined. As the weeks turned into months, the janitor found himself living between two worlds that once felt impossible to connect, and he moved through his days with a quiet confidence that surprised even him, because he no longer felt like he was hiding a secret part of himself, and instead he felt like he was slowly integrating who he had always been with who life had required him to become, and that balance gave him strength rather than confusion. Music returned to his life steadily, not in overwhelming waves, but in gentle, consistent moments, and he accepted small invitations to play at community gatherings, cultural events, and modest private evenings. And each time he sat at a piano, he reminded himself that this was not about proving anything to anyone, but about honoring the craft he loved, and the discipline he had never truly abandoned, even during the hardest years. People who heard him play often asked why he had waited so long to return to music, and he answered honestly, saying that sometimes survival demands silence, and that dreams are not always lost, they are sometimes postponed, until the heart is ready to carry them again. And his words resonated deeply with listeners who saw pieces of their own unfinished hopes reflected in his journey. At work, his supervisors noticed the change in him, not only in how others treated him, but in how he carried himself, and they offered flexibility, allowing him to adjust schedules when performances arose. And this gesture of trust meant more to him than praise, because it showed respect for his humanity rather than his utility, and he responded by continuing to work with dedication and care. The rich man remained a distant presence, yet his shadow still lingered, because the janitor knew that the challenge was not over, and that moments of transformation often invite resistance. And one afternoon, the rich man approached him unexpectedly, speaking in a controlled tone and acknowledging that the performance had been impressive. And while the words sounded polite, they carried an undercurrent of unease and pride struggling to coexist. The janitor listened calmly and thanked him without resentment or submission. And in that exchange, something subtle shifted, because the power dynamic no longer felt one-sided, and the rich man sensed it, realizing that respect could not be commanded once it had been earned elsewhere. and this realization unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. As invitations continued, the janitor faced an internal question about identity, and he wondered whether embracing music fully meant leaving behind the life he had built through honest labor. And after long reflection, he understood that dignity did not belong to one role alone, and that there was honor in work regardless of form, when it was done with integrity and intent. He chose to remain grounded, continuing his job while allowing music to grow naturally, and this decision protected him from the fear of sudden loss, because he had learned that stability and passion did not have to compete, and that life could hold space for both if approached with patience and clarity. One evening after a performance, a young man approached him sharing that he worked multiple jobs and dreamed of becoming a musician, but feared it was too late, and the janitor listened carefully, recognizing himself in the hesitation. And he spoke gently, telling him that time does not erase ability, and that the greatest loss is not failure but silence, and those words carried weight because they were born from lived experience rather than theory. That conversation stayed with him, and he began offering informal lessons to a few interested individuals, not as a teacher seeking authority, but as a guide sharing what he had learned through discipline, hardship, and perseverance. And in doing so, he discovered another layer of purpose, because helping others reconnect with their dreams gave deeper meaning to his own return. The community slowly began to recognize him not as a curiosity, but as a presence, and his story spread quietly, inspiring others to look beyond labels and assumptions. And this shift did not inflate his ego, because he remained mindful of how quickly circumstances could change, and he anchored himself in gratitude and humility. The rich man observed these developments from afar, and though he outwardly dismissed them, he felt an uncomfortable awareness growing within him, because he realized that his careless judgment had revealed more about himself than about the janitor. And that realization stirred a rare sense of self-doubt and reflection. As seasons changed, the janitor stood one morning in the empty hall once more, and the piano waited silently, and he played a few quiet notes not for an audience but for himself, and he smiled, because he understood that his journey was not about dramatic triumph, but about reclaiming voice, agency, and truth one step at a time. He knew challenges would come and that acceptance was never guaranteed, but he also knew that he no longer needed permission to exist fully, and that knowledge grounded him deeply. And as he continued walking forward carrying both mop and music, he did so without shame, knowing that his worth was no longer defined by how others saw him, but by how honestly he lived and expressed the life within him. The growing recognition brought with it a new kind of pressure that the janitor had not expected, because attention, even when kind, carries weight and responsibility, and he felt this most strongly when people began to project expectations onto him, seeing him not just as a man who rediscovered music, but as a symbol of hidden genius and second chances. And while he appreciated the encouragement, he reminded himself daily that he was still human, still learning, and still allowed to move at his own pace. He noticed that audiences now listened with a different intensity, searching for meaning in every note. And while that attention was respectful, it also challenged him to stay grounded in sincerity rather than performance, and he returned often to the reason. He began playing again, which was not to impress but to express, and that intention guided his practice, and his choices keeping him aligned with his values. At work, the balance between his responsibilities and his musical commitments required careful navigation, and there were days when fatigue tested his resolve, because physical labor and artistic discipline demanded energy from the same body, and he learned to listen closely to his limits, resting when needed and pushing gently when possible, and this awareness became an extension of the patience he had cultivated over years of hardship. The rich man, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated in his certainty, because the story that once elevated him as a figure of authority now cast him in an uncomfortable light. And though no one openly challenged him, his casual remarks were met with silence rather than laughter. And he sensed the shift, realizing that influence built on dismissal erodes when confronted by authenticity. And this realization unsettled him deeply. One afternoon, a meeting was held to plan a major upcoming event, and the janitor was present in his usual role, yet the dynamic in the room had changed. And when music was discussed, several people glanced toward him with quiet respect. And though he did not speak unless asked, his presence alone altered the tone of the conversation, and the rich man noticed this, feeling his control slipping in subtle but undeniable ways. Later that day, the rich man approached him again, this time with a different posture, less confrontational, more curious, and he asked questions not about technique but about motivation. And the janitor answered honestly, explaining that music was a form of truth for him, a way to stay connected to who he was beyond circumstance. And the simplicity of that answer struck something in the rich man that he had long ignored within himself. For the first time, the rich man did not interrupt or deflect, and though he said little, his silence carried reflection rather than judgment, and the janitor sensed that this conversation mattered not because it resolved tension, but because it introduced humility into a space once ruled by ego, and that shift, while quiet, felt significant. As opportunities continued to grow, the janitor was invited to collaborate with other musicians, and stepping into those spaces challenged him in new ways because collaboration required vulnerability, trust, and openness. And he embraced the learning curve, welcoming feedback and sharing credit generously. And this approach strengthened connections and reinforced his belief that art thrives in shared experience rather than competition. One collaboration in particular stood out, involving a small ensemble that valued emotional honesty over technical perfection, and playing with them reminded him of his early days when music was about connection rather than recognition. And that reminder anchored him during moments when expectations threatened to overshadow joy. Outside of music, he continued mentoring, quietly offering guidance to those navigating uncertain paths. And he listened more than he spoke, understanding that sometimes presence mattered more than advice. And people responded to his calm, grounded demeanor because it carried the weight of lived experience rather than abstract wisdom. The rich man observed these interactions, and though he struggled to admit it, he felt a sense of admiration mixed with regret. And he began questioning the assumptions he had built his identity upon, wondering whether success defined by dominance had cost him deeper forms of fulfillment. And these questions lingered, unsettling but necessary. As winter approached, the janitor faced a moment of decision when offered a more prominent role in a cultural program that required greater commitment and visibility. And he weighed the opportunity, carefully considering not only what it offered but what it demanded. And after thoughtful reflection, he accepted with conditions, ensuring that he could maintain balance and integrity. And this choice reflected his growth because he no longer equated opportunity with obligation. The program introduced him to a wider audience, yet he remained intentional in how he presented himself, sharing his story without embellishment, and emphasizing that talent exists in many forms, often overlooked by systems that prioritize access over ability. And his message resonated deeply, sparking conversations that extended beyond music into broader reflections on dignity and opportunity. The rich man attended one of these events, quietly standing at the back, observing without announcement. And as he listened, he recognized the depth of impact that humility and perseverance could have. And for the first time, he felt compelled not to assert, but to listen, and that shift marked a subtle turning point within him. As the janitor concluded the performance that evening, he felt a familiar calm settle within him because he understood that his journey was not about arriving at a destination, but about continuing to walk with honesty, courage, and patience. And as applause filled the room, he accepted it with gratitude but not dependence, knowing that his worth was anchored not in approval, but in alignment with his truth, and that understanding prepared him for the challenges and revelations still ahead. The change within the rich man did not arrive suddenly or cleanly, because transformation rarely does, and instead it unfolded through small moments of discomfort, reflection, and quiet realization. And he found himself thinking about the janitor more often than he expected, not as a symbol or a story, but as a person whose calm strength had exposed something fragile within himself that he had ignored for years. He began noticing how often he spoke to assert dominance rather than to connect, and how his jokes often carried sharp edges disguised as confidence. And these observations unsettled him because they revealed habits built over a lifetime of privilege, where success had insulated him from self-examination. And the janitor presence had quietly removed that insulation, forcing him to sit with questions he had never needed to ask before. At the same time, the janitor continued moving forward steadily, neither chasing recognition nor retreating from it. And he remained consistent in his work and music, showing up with the same humility whether the room held 5 people or 500, and that consistency built trust among those around him, because it proved that his character was not shaped by attention, but rooted in principle. The cultural program expanded and invited the janitor to speak briefly between performances, sharing his perspective on resilience and patience. And he approached these moments carefully, choosing words that reflected honesty rather than inspiration. And he spoke about how talent often survives quietly beneath hardship, and how dignity is not given by others, but claimed through self-respect and service. And audiences listened deeply because his words carried lived truth rather than performance. After one such event, the rich man requested a private conversation, and when they met, there was no audience, no hierarchy, no spectacle. And the rich man spoke openly, acknowledging that his earlier behavior had been careless and dismissive. And while the apology was imperfect and hesitant, it was sincere, and the janitor received it calmly without resentment or triumph, because he understood that humility often arrives awkwardly, and that growth requires patience on both sides. That conversation did not erase the past, but it softened its edges and created space for mutual understanding. And the janitor left feeling lighter, not because he had been validated, but because he had witnessed accountability, and that mattered deeply to him, because it affirmed his belief that people can change when confronted with truth and given room to reflect. The rich man, on the other hand, felt unsettled yet relieved, because speaking honestly released a tension he had carried unknowingly. And though his world did not change overnight, he began interacting differently with those around him, listening more, interrupting less, and questioning his assumptions before voicing them. And these small shifts began altering the atmosphere in spaces he occupied. Meanwhile, the janitor faced a personal test when an old acquaintance from his past re-entered his life, reminding him of missed opportunities and unfulfilled promises. And the encounter stirred regret and self-doubt, because it highlighted how much time had passed and how many paths had closed, and he spent several nights reflecting on whether he had waited too long to reclaim his dream. In those moments, he returned to the piano not to perform, but to listen, and the music grounded him, reminding him that time does not erase meaning, and that growth is not measured by speed but by sincerity. And through this reflection, he reaffirmed his commitment to move forward without bitterness toward his past choices, because those choices had shaped his resilience and empathy. Opportunities continued to arise, including an invitation to participate in a regional festival, and this marked a significant step, because it placed him among musicians who had followed more traditional paths, and the prospect intimidated him because comparison threatened to undermine his confidence. And he addressed this fear directly, choosing to prepare with discipline, while releasing the need to measure himself against others. At the festival, he played with quiet focus, allowing his authenticity to guide him. And while he did not seek attention, his performance resonated deeply with listeners, and fellow musicians approached him afterward, expressing admiration not only for his skill, but for the depth of emotion he conveyed. And this recognition felt different because it came from peers who understood the language of music intimately. The rich man attended the festival anonymously, blending into the crowd. And as he listened, he felt a profound shift, because he no longer viewed the janitor through the lens of surprise or contradiction, but through respect and understanding. And he realized that his earlier laughter had been a defense against confronting a world more complex and humbling than he preferred to acknowledge. As the festival concluded, the janitor reflected on how far he had come, not in status, but in self-trust, and he recognized that each step forward had required courage, not to be seen, but to remain true. And that realization reinforced his belief that integrity is the foundation upon which lasting fulfillment is built. The rich man later reached out, offering support for community music programs, not as a gesture of redemption, but as a sincere attempt to contribute positively. And while the janitor did not guide this decision, he acknowledged it with appreciation, understanding that change manifests through action rather than words alone. As winter gave way to early signs of spring, both men stood at different points in their journeys, yet connected by a shared moment that had altered their trajectories. And the janitor continued balancing work, music, and mentorship with steady grace, while the rich man navigated his evolving understanding of leadership and respect. And neither knew exactly where these paths would lead, but both sensed that something essential had shifted within them. The janitor closed this chapter of his life with quiet gratitude, recognizing that the power of his story lay not in its drama, but in its honesty and endurance. And as he prepared for what lay ahead, he carried a calm confidence grounded in the knowledge that his voice mattered, not because it was finally heard, but because it had always been there, waiting patiently for the right moment to speak. The final season of change arrived quietly, and with it came a sense of completion that did not feel like an ending, but settling into truth. And the janitor, now known by his name in many places, woke each morning with clarity rather than urgency. And he understood that his life no longer needed a dramatic turning point, because the most important shift had already happened within him. He continued his work at the building with the same care as always, and the floors still shone, and the halls still echoed with footsteps of power and privilege. Yet the space felt different to him now, because it no longer defined his worth. And when he passed the piano, he sometimes paused, not to play, but to smile, acknowledging the role it had played in reconnecting him to himself. Music remained a steady presence, woven naturally into his life, and he performed regularly at community events, schools, and small halls where people came not to witness a miracle, but to feel something honest. And he played with restraint and depth, allowing silence and simplicity to speak alongside sound, and listeners often described feeling understood rather than impressed, which mattered most to him. His mentorship grew quietly, and several young musicians found confidence through his guidance, and he never promised success or recognition, but offered patience, discipline, and self-respect. And he watched with pride as others learned to trust their voices and choices. And in this role, he found a fulfillment that rivaled performance, because it extended the impact of his journey beyond himself. The rich man continued his own transformation, choosing to step back from performative authority and into more thoughtful leadership. And he invested time and resources into programs that created access rather than spectacle. And though he never sought public praise for these efforts, the change in his demeanor was evident to those around him, and the distance he once maintained softened into approachability. When the two men crossed paths now, their interactions were marked by mutual respect and simplicity, and they spoke as equals about work, music, and life. And there was no need to revisit the past, because its lesson had already been absorbed, and what remained was an understanding built not on status but on shared humanity. One evening, a large gathering was held at the same hall where everything had begun, and the janitor was invited to perform not as a challenge or novelty, but as a featured artist. And as he walked onto the stage, he felt calm, grounded, and grateful. and he looked out at the audience seeing faces from every background united by attention and openness. He played a piece that carried the weight of his journey not through drama, but through honesty, and the music moved steadily reflecting endurance, loss, forgiveness, and quiet hope. And when the final notes faded, the applause rose warm and sustained, and he accepted it with humility, bowing not to elevate himself, but to honor the shared moment. After the performance, he stepped away from the spotlight, returning to the edges of the room where conversation flowed easily, and he felt at peace knowing that recognition had found its place without consuming him. And he understood that fulfillment comes when purpose and presence align rather than when applause grows louder. Later that night, as the hall emptied, he walked alone past the piano one last time and rested his hand on it gently. And he whispered thanks not out loud but in intention, and he knew that his life would continue to evolve, bringing new challenges and quiet victories. And he felt ready for all of it. He no longer measured his days by what he lacked or by who overlooked him. And instead he measured them by how honestly he lived, how generously he listened, and how faithfully he showed up. And this way of living brought a peace that no title or promise ever could. As seasons continued to turn, his story spread not as a tale of sudden triumph, but as a reminder that dignity, resilience, and talent often live unnoticed until courage invites them forward, and people who heard his story saw themselves reflected in it, finding permission to reclaim parts of their own lives they had set aside. The janitor who played like a genius did not marry wealth or status, and he did not need to because he had married truth, purpose, and self-respect, and these companions stayed with him through every role he carried. In the end, his life did not change because someone scoffed or challenged him, but because he chose to speak through the language he loved, and the world responded not with disbelief, but with recognition, and that recognition, while meaningful, was secondary to the quiet victory of becoming whole again. And so the story closed not with a declaration, but with continuity as he moved forward carrying mop and music, memory and hope. And he did so knowing that his worth had never been hidden, only waiting. And now it walked freely into the future, steady, honest, and unafraid.